I once heard an old trapper say that the greatest Christmas gift in the frontier was never hanging from the antlers of a deer. It was the stranger who quietly changed the direction of your life. Jacob Miller laughed the first time he heard those words. By sunset on Christmas Eve, he was no longer laughing. The mountains of northern Arizona stood silent beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Fresh snow covered the pines, softening every ridge and trail until the wilderness looked almost untouched by human hands. Jacob pulled his coat tighter against the bitter wind as his horse moved carefully through the narrow forest path. His cabin pantry had grown nearly empty after a difficult autumn, and Christmas morning would arrive with little more than dried beans unless he managed to bring home fresh venison before nightfall. He had hunted these woods for years. Every stream, every rocky slope, every twisted pine carried memories of seasons spent alone. Solitude had become as familiar as the saddle beneath him. It did not hurt anymore. At least that was what he had spent years convincing himself. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the branches while distant ravens circled above the valley. Jacob noticed fresh deer tracks crossing the trail only minutes before. He dismounted quietly, tying his horse beside an old cedar tree before following the prints deeper into the woods. The forest seemed unusually still. Even the wind held its breath. He stopped beside a frozen creek and knelt to study another set of tracks pressed into the snow. They did not belong to a deer. They belonged to a person walking barefoot for part of the journey before disappearing beneath worn moccasins. The footprints wandered without direction, as though whoever left them had become too tired to care where the trail ended. Jacob frowned. Travelers rarely crossed these mountains during winter, and no sensible hunter would venture this far from shelter before a storm. A stronger gust swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar smoke mixed with crushed sage. That was when he heard it. Not a cry for help, not even a voice, only the quiet sound of someone struggling to breathe. Beyond the curtain of snow-covered pines, he pushed aside heavy branches and stepped into a small clearing where an enormous fallen cottonwood rested across the frozen ground. Beneath its shelter sat a young Apache woman wrapped in a weathered buckskin shawl dusted with snow. Her long black braid rested over one shoulder. A leather medicine pouch lay against her side, and a small bundle of carefully tied herbs remained protected beneath her hands despite the freezing cold. Her warm brown eyes lifted slowly toward the stranger, standing only a few yards away. There was caution in her gaze, but no hatred. Only exhaustion carried with quiet dignity. Jacob lowered his rifle until the barrel pointed harmlessly toward the ground. He removed his gloves before taking one careful step forward. The woman watched every movement without speaking. Snow settled silently between them while the afternoon light faded behind towering pines. Jacob stopped several feet away, giving her room to decide whether his presence was welcome. He had seen enough hardship in the frontier to understand that kindness often arrived too quickly for people who had learned to survive by trusting no one. He reached inside his saddlebag and slowly removed a small flask of warm water wrapped inside wool cloth. He placed it gently upon a flat stone before stepping back again. The woman studied the flask for several long moments before accepting it with trembling hands. She drank only one careful sip before returning it, as though taking more than she needed would somehow burden the stranger. Jacob noticed how pale she had become beneath the winter light. Dark clouds gathered once again above the mountains, promising another heavy snowfall before nightfall. If they remained here much longer, neither of them would reach shelter before darkness swallowed the trail. He finally spoke in a calm voice that barely rose above the whispering wind. "My cabin is less than 3 miles from here. You will be safe until the storm passes." She looked toward the forest, then back into his steady blue eyes. For several quiet seconds, neither of them moved. Finally, she rose carefully to her feet, steadying herself against the fallen tree. As Jacob stepped forward to offer support, she lifted one gentle hand between them and spoke her first words, soft enough to almost disappear beneath the falling snow. "Do not rush." Jacob remained exactly where he was, his outstretched hand slowly lowering to his side as the young Apache woman spoke those 2 quiet words. Snow continued falling between them, covering old footprints almost as quickly as they had been made. He nodded gently. "All right," he answered. "We will not rush." A faint expression crossed her face, almost too small to notice, as though he had unknowingly passed a test without realizing one had been given. She adjusted the worn buckskin shawl around her shoulders and steadied herself against the fallen cottonwood before taking one careful step toward him. The winter wind carried another wave of icy air through the pines, reminding Jacob that the mountains would soon become impossible to cross before nightfall. He led his horse slowly beside her instead of asking her to ride immediately. Every few yards he paused, allowing her to choose the pace. Neither of them spoke very much. The only sounds were the gentle crunch of boots in fresh snow, the soft breathing of the horse, and the whisper of pine branches swaying overhead. After nearly half a mile, she quietly rested one hand against the saddle for support. Jacob looked at her, but asked nothing. A few moments later she accepted his silent invitation and climbed onto the horse without assistance. He walked beside the animal for the rest of the journey, leading it carefully along the narrow trail while the snowfall grew heavier behind them. By the time his small log cabin appeared between towering evergreens, dusk had already settled across the mountains. Thin ribbons of smoke still drifted from the stone chimney, where the morning fire had continued burning beneath thick logs. Jacob opened the wooden door, and a wave of comforting warmth rolled into the frozen evening air. The scent of cedar, fresh coffee, and seasoned pine filled the small room. There was only one rocking chair beside the fireplace, one narrow bed against the far wall, a sturdy wooden table, and shelves, lined with carefully preserved jars collected through many lonely seasons. It had always been enough for one man. Tonight it suddenly felt much too small. The woman remained near the doorway for several quiet moments, studying every corner of the cabin before stepping inside. She removed her snow-covered shawl and carefully hung it near the fire without being asked. Jacob placed another log onto the flames until golden light filled the room. He poured hot water into a kettle, added dried herbs gathered during autumn, and prepared a simple vegetable soup from potatoes, onions, carrots, and the last pieces of smoked venison remaining in his pantry. While the soup slowly simmered, the woman reached into her weathered leather medicine pouch and carefully removed several bundles of dried leaves tied with thin strips of bark. She noticed Jacob rubbing one shoulder after carrying firewood and quietly pointed toward the kettle. "May I?" she asked. Jacob nodded. She added only a few fragrant leaves to the steaming water. Within moments the cabin filled with the clean scent of mountain sage and sweet cedar. "It helps tired muscles," she explained softly. Jacob smiled with genuine appreciation. "Then I suppose Christmas arrived earlier than I expected." She looked into the dancing fire without answering immediately. Finally, she spoke in the same calm voice that had stopped him in the forest. "The mountains teach us that trust grows like winter trees. Slowly. If you rush them, they break." Jacob stirred the soup while thinking about those words. Outside, the storm covered every trail leading away from the cabin. Inside, the fire glowed brighter with every passing minute. For the first time in many winters, the silence surrounding Christmas Eve no longer felt empty. A bright Christmas morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow that shimmered beneath the first rays of sunlight pouring through the cabin windows. Jacob woke before dawn out of habit, quietly adding another cedar log to the fireplace until warm orange light danced across the wooden walls. For years, Christmas had followed the same lonely pattern. He brewed coffee, repaired whatever needed fixing around the cabin, and waited for another winter day to quietly pass. This morning felt different before he could explain why. Ayanna was already awake. She stood outside beside the frozen creek, her hands gently brushing snow from the low branches of a young pine tree. The mountain air carried the crisp scent of evergreen mixed with wood smoke drifting from the chimney. Jacob stepped onto the porch holding 2 steaming cups. Without speaking, he offered one to her. She accepted it with a grateful smile, warming her hands around the tin cup before taking a careful sip. They stood together listening to the peaceful silence that only fresh snowfall could bring. Finally, Ayanna pointed toward a set of tiny rabbit tracks crossing the untouched snow. "The forest tells its stories differently in winter," she said softly. Jacob looked down at the delicate prints disappearing beneath the trees. "I only ever saw tracks that led to food." She smiled gently. "Then today the mountain can teach you something new." After breakfast, she asked if he would walk with her into the woods. They left the cabin carrying only simple baskets instead of hunting gear. The snow reached nearly halfway to their boots. Yet Ayana moved through the forest with quiet confidence, stopping every so often beside evergreen shrubs, weathered rocks, or fallen logs hidden beneath white blankets of snow. She carefully uncovered clusters of winter herbs that Jacob had passed hundreds of times without noticing. She explained which leaves eased fever, which roots soothed aching joints, and which fragrant needles could be brewed into tea rich enough to strengthen tired bodies during long winters. Jacob listened with genuine curiosity. For the first time in years, he crossed these familiar mountains without searching for prey. He found himself searching for understanding instead. Near midday, they reached a small clearing where sunlight poured through towering pines onto untouched snow. Ayana knelt beside a young evergreen growing alone at the center of the clearing. She carefully brushed away the snow covering its roots. "My grandmother taught me that every winter tree survives because it never fights the season," she said. "It bends beneath the snow until spring returns." Jacob rested one gloved hand against the rough bark. "I spent most of my life believing strength meant standing alone." Ayana looked toward him with calm brown eyes. "Perhaps standing beside someone is another kind of strength." Those words settled quietly between them while snowflakes drifted through golden sunlight. As they returned toward the cabin, Jacob noticed a small pine cone lying beside the trail. He picked it up almost absent-mindedly and slipped it into his coat pocket. Back inside the cabin, he carved it carefully into the shape of a tiny Christmas tree using the same pocket knife that had repaired fences, saddles, and wagon wheels for years. The little wooden carving was simple, almost imperfect, but he placed it carefully on the center of the table beside two candles. Ayana studied the tiny gift for several moments before smiling. "In my family," she whispered, "small things carried with honest hands become the ones remembered longest." Jacob looked at the little carving glowing beside the fire and realized that although Christmas morning had begun with almost nothing, the lonely cabin somehow felt fuller than it ever had, not because of gifts, but because every quiet hour shared inside those snow-covered mountains was teaching two strangers that patience could slowly become trust, and trust could quietly become the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. The days after Christmas passed with a quiet rhythm that neither Jacob nor Ayana had expected. The storm finally loosened its grip on the mountains, but fresh snow still covered every trail leading beyond the forest, making travel difficult for anyone without good reason to leave. Jacob found himself secretly grateful each morning when another light snowfall settled across the valley, buying one more peaceful day inside the little cabin. One afternoon, he carried a freshly cut evergreen inside and placed it beside the stone fireplace. It was not large, only a young pine no taller than his shoulder, but its clean scent filled the room with the fragrance of the surrounding mountains. Ayana watched with quiet curiosity as he carefully tied small strips of cloth, dried orange peels saved from autumn, and simple wooden stars onto the branches. She picked up the tiny carved Christmas tree he had made the day before and gently placed it near the center of the decorations. "It belongs here," she said softly. Jacob smiled. "It is not much." She looked toward the glowing fire before answering. "The things made with patient hands are never small." As evening approached, Ayana gathered fresh pine needles, cedar leaves, and fragrant herbs from her medicine pouch before arranging them around the cabin. The warm scent mixed with fresh bread baking inside the iron oven and cinnamon that Jacob had carefully saved for Christmas. The simple room suddenly carried both the traditions of the frontier and the quiet spirit of her people, without either one replacing the other. After supper, Jacob disappeared into the small workshop attached to the back of the cabin. The steady sound of carving drifted through the wooden walls while snowflakes floated gently outside beneath a sky filled with stars. Nearly an hour later, he returned carrying something wrapped in a folded cloth. He placed it carefully on the table between them, but did not speak. Ayana slowly unfolded the cloth and discovered a beautifully carved wooden bird resting inside. Its wings were partly open, as though ready to rise into the winter sky. Every feather had been shaped with remarkable patience despite the rough piece of pine from which it had been carved. She gently ran her fingers across the smooth wood without saying a word. Finally, she looked at Jacob. "You carved this today?" He nodded with quiet embarrassment. "I remembered watching birds gather outside the clearing where we met. I thought perhaps one should stay inside until spring." Ayana smiled. her warm brown eyes reflecting the firelight. From her medicine pouch, she removed a small braided cord woven from soft leather and decorated with tiny blue beads carved from polished stone. She carefully tied it around the wooden bird before handing it back to him. "Now it carries both our journeys," she whispered. Jacob looked at the simple ornament hanging beneath the bird's carved wings. It was the first object inside the cabin that truly belonged to both of them. They placed it together near the top of the little evergreen where the firelight made the blue stones glow softly among the branches. Later that evening, someone knocked gently upon the cabin door. Jacob opened it to find an elderly widower from a neighboring ranch standing in the snow with a broken sled loaded with firewood. Without hesitation, Jacob invited him inside, while Ayanna prepared hot tea flavored with mountain herbs. They repaired the sled together, shared fresh bread, and sent the grateful traveler home with enough food to last several days. After the old man disappeared into the snowy forest, Jacob quietly watched the cabin grow peaceful once again. He realized something remarkable had happened without either of them planning it. The lonely place that had once sheltered only one silent cowboy had already begun becoming the kind of home where strangers always found warmth before they found questions. Nearly 2 weeks passed before the mountain trails slowly began revealing patches of earth beneath the melting snow. Every sunrise carried a little more warmth, and every evening lingered a little longer beneath skies painted with soft shades of gold and pale blue. Jacob noticed the change in the forest first. Birds returned to the pine branches outside the cabin. Deer cautiously wandered closer to the nearby meadow, and the frozen creek once again whispered beneath thin sheets of breaking ice. Yet another change quietly unfolded inside the cabin itself. 2 cups now rested beside the coffee pot every morning without either of them thinking about it. 2 chairs stood beside the fireplace after Jacob spent an afternoon building another one from seasoned pine. The lonely cabin no longer looked as though it belonged to a single traveler waiting for another season to pass. One crisp morning, Ayanna stepped outside carrying her woven basket and paused beside the edge of the forest. She studied the distant hills with thoughtful eyes before quietly saying, "My people will begin searching when the mountain paths open." Jacob gently nodded while adjusting the harness on his horse. "I have known that day was coming." Neither of them said anything else. The silence between them held no discomfort. It simply carried the quiet understanding that some moments arrived whether hearts were ready or not. Together, they spent the day repairing sections of the old split-rail fence that winter storms had damaged. Jacob replaced broken posts while Ayanna gathered fallen branches and tied fresh willow strips around weakened rails. They worked side by side with the easy rhythm that only grows between people who no longer need many words. By afternoon, an elderly widow from a neighboring homestead arrived, pulling a small sled filled with empty grain sacks. Heavy snowfall had destroyed part of her chicken coop, and she feared losing the last of her hens before spring. Without hesitation, Jacob gathered spare lumber from his shed, while Ayanna filled a small pouch with herbs that would help calm the frightened birds after the long winter storms. The 3 of them spent the remainder of the afternoon rebuilding the simple shelter beneath clear blue skies. Before leaving, the grateful woman placed a small basket of homemade biscuits into Ayanna's hands. "You both have given this mountain more kindness than you know," she said with a warm smile. As the widow disappeared down the snowy trail, Jacob noticed something that surprised him. Travelers had begun stopping at his cabin not because they needed a cowboy. They came because they believed someone inside would always help. That evening, the fire burned low while gentle rain tapped softly against the cabin roof, carrying away the last traces of winter. Ayanna removed the little wooden bird from the evergreen tree, now beginning to dry after the holidays had passed. She carefully untied the blue braided cord before handing the carving back to Jacob. "The season has changed," she whispered. Jacob looked at the smooth wooden bird resting in his hands. "Then perhaps you should take it with you." She gently closed his fingers around the carving and slowly shook her head. "No. It belongs where patience first found a home." Jacob stared into the glowing fire, unable to answer. He understood that she was preparing him for goodbye long before the words would ever be spoken. Outside, melting snow dripped steadily from the roof, while distant geese flew north across the evening sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains, her people were almost certainly searching for her. Somewhere beyond the quiet comfort of the cabin, The road that had first brought them together was quietly preparing to ask whether kindness was only meant for a season or whether it possessed the strength to endure long after winter had finally disappeared. 3 mornings later, Jacob awoke to the distant sound of horses moving carefully through the pine forest beyond the cabin. The rhythm was slow and measured, not the hurried pace of frightened travelers, but the calm confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. He stepped onto the porch just as the first sunlight reached the mountaintops. Across the narrow meadow, several Apache riders emerged between the tall evergreens, their horses walking quietly through patches of melting snow. They carried no raised weapons and spoke only in low voices as they approached. Ayanna stepped outside a moment later and stopped beside Jacob. She closed her eyes briefly, as though recognizing familiar spirits long before recognizing familiar faces. When she opened them again, a gentle smile replaced the quiet sadness that had slowly settled upon her during the previous week. An older Apache man with silver threaded through his long black hair guided his horse forward until he stood a respectful distance from the cabin. His weathered face carried relief rather than suspicion. He placed one hand over his heart before speaking softly in his own language. Ayanna answered with the same calm warmth that Jacob had come to know beside countless winter evenings. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet Jacob understood enough by their expressions to realize that her family had finally found her. The elder then turned toward Jacob and spoke carefully in clear English. "You gave shelter when the mountain gave only snow." Jacob removed his hat respectfully. Anyone should have done the same. The elder smiled kindly. Many would not. Those simple words settled into the quiet morning air more deeply than any grand speech could have. While the visitors rested beside the creek, Ayanna walked with Jacob toward the edge of the forest where the first wildflowers had begun pushing through the melting snow. Neither of them hurried. The forest itself seemed to understand that certain conversations deserved the patience of spring. She gently traced one finger across the rough bark of an old pine tree before speaking. "They have come to bring me home." Jacob nodded without lifting his eyes from the trail beneath his boots. "I expected they would." Another long silence followed. Birds sang high above the branches while clear water flowed freely beneath the last thin sheets of ice. Finally, Jacob reached inside the pocket of his coat and carefully removed the small wooden bird he had carved during Christmas. The blue braided cord still hung beneath its wings. He placed it gently into Ayanna's hands. "This belongs with you now." She looked down at the carving, turning it slowly between her fingers before quietly closing Jacob's hand around it once more. "No," she whispered. "It belongs here. If I take it, it becomes only a memory. If it stays, it remains a promise." Jacob searched her calm brown eyes, but found no sadness there, only quiet certainty. Before he could answer, she reached into her medicine pouch and removed a small, smooth stone wrapped inside soft leather. "Carry this until the mountain brings us together again." Jacob accepted the simple gift with both hands. He wanted to ask whether that day would truly come, but the words never left his lips. Ayanna had taught him from the beginning that the strongest truths never needed to be chased. As the afternoon sun drifted lower across the valley, the Apache riders prepared for the journey home. Jacob helped tighten saddle blankets, filled water canteens from the creek, and loaded fresh bread onto one of the pack horses without being asked. When everything was ready, Ayanna climbed quietly into the saddle and looked back toward the little cabin nestled among the pines. Her gentle smile carried the same quiet wisdom that had first greeted him beneath the winter storm. "Some journeys," she said softly, "must finish before the next one can begin." Then the riders disappeared slowly through the tall evergreens, leaving behind only melting snow, birdsong, and one lonely cowboy standing before a cabin that somehow felt both emptier than ever and fuller of hope than it had been at any time in his life. Spring settled gently across the mountains, replacing the last traces of winter with clear streams, green meadows, and the quiet songs of returning birds. Nearly 3 months had passed since Ayanna disappeared beyond the pine forest with her people, yet the cabin still carried small reminders of her presence. The woven basket she had repaired rested beside the fireplace. The scent of mountain sage lingered faintly inside the cedar walls whenever rain drifted through the open windows. The second wooden chair remained beside the hearth exactly where she had once sat, and although Jacob occasionally considered moving it back into storage, he never did. Some mornings he caught himself pouring coffee into 2 cups before quietly smiling and returning one to the shelf. Life continued as it always had. Fences needed mending. Horses needed brushing. Gardens demanded patient hands. Yet the silence no longer felt empty. It felt as though it were waiting. One bright afternoon, Jacob rode into the nearest frontier settlement to deliver lumber and purchase flour, lamp oil, and fresh coffee beans. The little town buzzed with the energy that always arrived after winter ended. Farmers traded seeds, children chased one another through dusty streets, and merchants greeted travelers beneath colorful awnings. As Jacob loaded supplies into his wagon, the elderly storekeeper handed him a carefully folded bundle wrapped in soft buckskin. "Someone asked me to give this to the cowboy with the cedar cabin if he ever came through town," the old man explained. Jacob accepted the package with quiet curiosity. There was no name written anywhere, only a small blue bead tied into the leather cord around the bundle. He immediately recognized it. Back at the cabin that evening, he slowly untied the wrapping and discovered a beautifully woven pair of winter gloves lined with soft rabbit fur. Tucked inside rested a single folded piece of bark paper, carrying only a few carefully written words. "The mountains remembered." There was no signature. None was needed. Jacob sat beside the fire, turning the gloves over in his hands while the little wooden bird remained perched above the fireplace beside the tiny carved Christmas tree. He looked toward the smooth stone Iona had given him before leaving. Every object inside the cabin seemed connected by invisible threads of patience, kindness, and promises never spoken aloud. Days later, another unexpected visitor arrived. It was the elderly Apache man who had first thanked Jacob outside the cabin at the end of winter. This time he came alone, riding slowly beneath the warm afternoon sun. Jacob welcomed him with fresh coffee and warm bread. They spent hours repairing a broken saddle strap together before sitting quietly beneath the porch roof overlooking the valley. Finally, the elder smiled. "She speaks of this place often." Jacob looked toward the distant mountains, but remained silent. The elder continued gently. "She has not forgotten your cabin." Jacob lowered his eyes. "Some roads are meant to separate people." The elder slowly shook his head. "Only impatient roads." Before leaving, the elder reached inside his saddlebag and removed a small pine branch covered with fresh green needles. "She asked me to bring this." Jacob accepted the branch with careful hands. "Why?" The elder smiled as though remembering an old lesson. "Because she said you would understand." After the rider disappeared beyond the meadow, Jacob carried the pine branch inside and placed it beside the little wooden bird. Looking at the fresh green needles beside the Christmas carving, he suddenly understood. Winter had ended long ago. The promise had not. He stepped onto the porch just as the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar and mountain sage across the valley once more. Somewhere beyond the western ridges, another journey was quietly beginning, and for the first time in many years, Jacob did not feel the need to chase it. He simply smiled, trusting that patience, like every season worth waiting for, always found its way home. Summer arrived quietly in the high country, filling the valleys with waving grass, blooming wildflowers, and long golden evenings that lingered beneath endless western skies. Jacob no longer measured the passing months by the pages of a calendar, but by the changing sounds outside his cabin. The spring birds had raised their young. The creek flowed gently beneath warm sunshine, and every evening the scent of cedar drifted through open windows, carrying memories that no longer felt painful. They felt patient. One afternoon, while repairing a weathered fence near the meadow, Jacob noticed a familiar rider approaching slowly along the forest trail. It was the elderly Apache elder once again. This time he carried no message, no gift, and no hurried expression. He simply smiled before climbing down from his horse. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. Together they followed a narrow path leading toward a ridge where the valley stretched across miles of green hills and distant pine forests. The elder stopped beneath a broad cottonwood tree and looked toward the western horizon. "There is something I have wanted to understand," he said gently. Jacob waited quietly. "When she left, why did you not ask her to stay?" Jacob rested both hands upon the old wooden fence running beside the overlook. "Because kindness is not ownership," he answered after a long silence. "If I truly cared for her, the choice had to remain hers." The elder smiled with quiet satisfaction. She hoped you would answer that way. Jacob looked at him with mild surprise. She asked you. The elder nodded. She wondered whether your heart would become impatient after winter. A warm breeze carried the fragrance of pine needles across the ridge while hawks circled silently above the valley. The elder reached into a leather satchel resting beside him and carefully removed the small wooden bird that Jacob believed had remained inside his cabin. He placed it gently into Jacob's hands. The blue braided cord still hung beneath its carved wings, untouched since Christmas. She borrowed it while I visited your cabin yesterday, the elder explained with a quiet smile. Jacob looked closely and noticed something new tied beneath one wing. A tiny silver feather crafted from polished metal reflected the afternoon sunlight. The elder continued. She asked me to return it only if you still kept a place for patience inside your home. Jacob carefully touched the little silver feather before smiling to himself. Without realizing it, he had kept the second chair beside the fireplace, the extra coffee cup on the shelf, and the little evergreen carving upon the mantel through every changing season. He had never been waiting because someone told him to wait. He had simply never stopped believing that some promises grew stronger with time. As the sun slowly lowered behind the distant mountains, the elder prepared to leave. Before mounting his horse, he paused beside Jacob and spoke one final sentence. There is a gathering in our valley when the first leaves of autumn begin changing color. Every family shares food with travelers who arrive as friends. If your road carries you there, no one will ask why. Then he rode quietly back toward the western hills until both horse and rider disappeared among the towering pines. Jacob remained alone upon the ridge long after sunset painted the sky with deep shades of amber and crimson. He looked down at the little wooden bird resting beside the polished stone Iana had once placed in his hand. Slowly he slipped both keepsakes into his coat pocket before turning toward the cabin. For the first time since she had departed, he saddled his horse not because he wished to chase someone across the frontier, but because he finally understood that patience did not mean standing still forever. Sometimes patience simply meant waiting until the road itself was ready to invite you forward. Autumn arrived with quiet dignity, covering the high country in shades of amber, crimson, and deep gold. Cool morning air carried the scent of cedar, dry leaves, and distant campfires drifting across the valleys. Jacob followed the narrow mountain trail exactly as the elder had described, carrying only a small saddlebag, the smooth leather-wrapped stone Iana had given him, and the little wooden bird decorated with its blue braided cord and silver feather. He was not riding toward an uncertain future. He was simply following a road that no longer needed to be hurried. By late afternoon, the forest opened into a broad Apache valley alive with gentle celebration. Families gathered beneath towering cottonwood trees while children laughed beside clear streams and elders prepared long wooden tables filled with fresh bread, roasted squash, wild berries, herbs, and warm stews. Travelers from nearby ranches and settlements were welcomed with the same quiet hospitality. No one asked where a person had come from before offering a place to sit. Jacob removed his hat as he entered the gathering, feeling dozens of curious eyes settle upon him before warm smiles slowly replaced quiet surprise. Then he saw her. Iana stood beside the creek wearing the same calm expression that had first met him beneath the winter storm many months before. Her buckskin dress carried delicate autumn beadwork, and her long black braid rested across one shoulder. She walked toward him without haste, stopping only a few feet away. Neither of them reached for the other immediately. Instead, they smiled with the peaceful certainty shared by people who understood that some moments became more beautiful because they had been given time to grow. Jacob reached into his coat pocket and gently placed the little wooden bird into her hands. She looked at the carving, then carefully hung it upon the branch of a nearby cottonwood where the afternoon sunlight caught the tiny silver feather. Now it belongs where every traveler can see it, she whispered. Jacob nodded softly, and where every traveler can remember to be patient. They walked together through the gathering as neighbors, children, ranchers, and Apache families welcomed them with easy conversation that needed no explanations. Before sunset, the elder invited everyone to share the evening meal. When Jacob quietly looked for an empty place at the end of the table, Iana simply moved one chair beside her and smiled. You do not have to stand alone anymore. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate promises, and no dramatic declarations. Jacob simply took the empty chair. Sometimes the smallest decision changed an entire life. Years later, the little cedar cabin remained standing beside the mountain forest, but it was no longer known as the lonely cowboy's home. Travelers remembered it as the place where a warm fire was always waiting, where fresh bread was always shared before questions were asked, and where people from different worlds discovered that kindness needed no translation. Every Christmas, a small evergreen stood beside the stone fireplace decorated with a carved wooden bird, a tiny Christmas tree, a blue braided cord, and a silver feather. Children often asked why those simple ornaments mattered so much. Jacob would smile toward Ayanna before answering with the same quiet lesson that had transformed his own heart on a snowy afternoon long ago. The greatest gifts are never found by rushing. They arrive when we learn to walk with patience. Outside, snow would begin falling softly across the pines once again, just as it had on the day their paths first crossed. But inside the cabin, the fire always burned brightly, reminding everyone who entered that the longest journey in the Old West was never across mountains or forests. It was the quiet distance between fear and trust, between loneliness and belonging, and between opening a door for a stranger and discovering that you had quietly welcomed your future home.